The 2023 Beautiful England calendar features 12 locations across England which we have challenged ourselves to travel to on our motorbikes during the month that they feature. The destination for July is Hindhope Linn Waterfall in Kielder Water and Forest Park up in Northumberland, about 10 minutes drive away from the Scottish border and our furthest destination from our home near Leicester. At the end of the last video, I mentioned that we had discovered a leak on Frey's Yamaha XJ600, and unfortunately our trusted bike garage hadn't been able to do the work yet as it's summer, which means they're fully booked up with work, and they couldn't get her bike fixed in time for us to make this trip in July. With an already busy looking August, we didn't want to push this journey a month forward, so we instead decided to load up our campervan for its first big trip out since our 2019-2020 adventure and drive up there in the relative comfort of a converted 1999 Renault Master with a bed, kitchen, toilet and a fridge that doesn't work. This also meant that we didn't have to worry about getting wet in a tent, as the overly typical British weather seems to have forgotten that it's supposed to be summer right now. Our route would remain largely unchanged, though we decided instead to spend 2 nights out, rather than trying to get all the way up to a campsite in Kelso in one long day. Once again taking inspiration from the Bikers Britain book, who really should be bringing us some money for all the times I've talked about it, we would be taking the M1 up to Darlington before joining the A68, which according to the book is a genuine must-ride road, though hopefully it will be just as much fun in a large van that struggles with hills. Luckily, our waterfall destination is a short walk from a car park which is about a mile off the A68, and it's part of a 1-mile walking route through the woods. I had hastily picked out a spot to park up for that night near St Boswell's in a car park for a William Wallace statue that overlooks the River Tweed, before heading home along similar roads the next day. After accepting that we would be making this journey in the van, we decided at the last minute to leave after work on the Friday and spend the night up near Leeds before carrying on the next day. This would give us time to visit a bit of Hadrian's Wall not too far from the A68, as neither of us have visited the wall's remains before. We loaded up the van, including our cat Dargo, and headed off along the feature that is the M1. With all the typical M1 shenanigans that you would expect on a Friday evening. We spent the night in a lay-by just off junction 47 before making ourselves a cooked breakfast and heading back out along the M1 and the A1M. We had wanted to avoid motorways as much as possible for these calendar trips, but when there are such vast distances to cover, sticking to A roads can add several hours to the ride. With this route in particular, asking Google Maps to avoid motorways just has you following an A road that runs parallel to the M1 for most of its length, so you get all of the same boring views with none of the speed limits and intermittent roundabouts. After some more typical mediocrity on the A1M, we left at junction 56 and continued north until we joined the A68 just southeast of West Auckland. Along our journey, we had been secretly hoping that the weather would be awful, just so that we could feel a bit better about not being on the bikes. While we did hit a few patches of rain here and there, the weather was generally pretty ideal for a bike ride, leaving us somewhat jealous of the several riders we saw whiz past us in the opposite direction. Thankfully though, we didn't find ourselves holding up any two-wheeled compatriots along our route, which would have turned us into one of the things we hate the most. This section of the A68 mainly passes through several small towns and villages, but between settlements is a good mix of open straights and twisty sections that did make us jealous of our inability to lean around them. Our sat-nav took us off the A68 and onto the A69 to reach our first stop at a section of Hadrian's Wall. Not wanting to pay the frankly extortionate rates that English Heritage charge, we had picked a free site with a cheap pay-in display, charging £2 for an hour and £1 for every hour after that. This spot is the site of Broccolitia Roman Fort, which was built into the wall, and also features a nearby temple of Mithras, an old god whose religion of Mithraism was seen as a rivalry of early Christianity, but was suppressed and eliminated from the Roman Empire by the end of the 4th century AD. Apparently these temples have been found all across the old empire, and Mithras has been depicted as being born from a rock, slaughtering a bull and then feasting with the god's soul. Sounds like a busy day, and the temple remains here are in surprisingly good condition considering they're nearly 2,000 years old. The fort remains, however, are much less impressive, with nothing other than grassy mounds denoting the old walls, which apparently form part of Hadrian's Wall itself. After a bit of coffee from the slightly grumpy man selling it in the car park, we headed off again and back to the A68 to our proper destination of Hindhope Linn Waterfall. This next section of the A68 was fantastic, and we promised ourselves to definitely return here on the bikes in the future. It's the closest we've come to feeling like we're on a roller coaster while still being on the road, and it barely passes any towns or villages, making for an exciting and memorable ride all the way up to the border. Just before the border, but just after the hotels and cafes advertising that they are the last in the country, we turned off towards our car park. About a mile down a small tarmac road is the Hindhope car park. I probably butchered that pronunciation, but that's as close as it's going to get. It's a small car park next to a public toilet block, but it's free and there's room to park on the side of the road if need be. Our target waterfall is part of a route which the map suggests is 1.25 miles, but the signpost directly opposite said map suggests is only 1 mile. Either way, we headed off along the route and into the woods. The walk is fairly well signposted, at least at first, but after the colour coordinated arrows stop, the route is very obvious and it soon loops back on itself. About 10 minutes after leaving the van, we had found our waterfall. This was a tricky one to line up as it meant standing on the rocks in the stream, but as ever I think Frey did an excellent job of lining this one up with the calendar photo. We carried on along the rest of the route enjoying the woodland walk, though not stopping to appreciate it too much as there were hordes of midges out looking for their lunch. We eventually returned to the van and decided to drive up to the border and park up there for a while, as there is a viewing area on both sides of the A68 that look out over valleys on both sides. At least that was the plan, as when turning the key in the ignition we were met with a dull clunk rather than the engine roaring to life. We had heard this sound before. The starter motor had gone. Last time this happened it was a much more gradual incident, with it becoming harder and harder to start over several months until it just gave up. Today though, it just died, which was annoying and confusing as this motor was only replaced about 2 years ago. Luckily we still had phone signal, so we called the AA, who told us to use their app because it would be quicker. The app then told us to give them a call, which was a fun little game. They told us to expect to wait around an hour and a half, which admittedly is a lot easier to do when you have a bed and a small kitchen at your disposal. About 20 minutes later we got a call from a supposedly local garage who the AA was sending to get us. He told us that if it is the starter motor then he won't be able to fix it as he won't be able to get a replacement until Monday, so he was going to tow us. He then asked for me to send him the postcode of where we wanted to go. Now obviously, if we couldn't move the van, then we would need to go home, and our level of AA membership covers a tow to any destination on the UK mainland. When he saw how far away Leicester was, and the fact that he himself was over an hour away in Carlisle, he told us that he would take us as far as Scotch Corner, and then someone else would take us from there. After mentally preparing to be passed like a baton along the M1 until early on Sunday morning, we got another call from an AA mechanic telling us that he was about 10 minutes away. Rather confused as to why he was coming despite a tow being on its way, he told us that we flagged up as an optional job that he just decided to pick up on his way home. After he arrived, he quickly confirmed that it was the starter motor and then popped to his van to grab a big crowbar and a hammer. He asked me to turn the ignition and to hold it in place. As I did so, he twatted something with his crowbar and hammer a couple of times and the engine roared to life once again. We tried it again without the Fonzie technique and it worked perfectly. He said that a connection nut had just come loose, which apparently they can do sometimes, and that it would be good for the foreseeable future. After our deepest and sincere thanks and a renewed appreciation for roadside assistance, we hit the road again up to the viewpoint to take some obligatory photos on the border. Despite being assured that the issue was resolved, we were still unsure about spending the night in a small car park off a B road up a hill somewhere, so we instead settled on one of the backup spots that I had found for the night. The town of Howick has a free car park with spaces dedicated to motorhomes and also has facilities to drain wastewater and fill up on drinking water. These sorts of spots are fairly common across Europe, but something of a rarity in the UK, so we were absolutely grateful to have the option here. It's certainly not as scenic as the typical van life posts you see on Instagram, but there is an added security of knowing no one will have an issue with you being there, and there was a supermarket nearby we could use to treat ourselves to something sugary to make up for the couple of hours of stress we had just endured. After a very quiet night, we filled up with fuel and headed home. It was a 5-hour drive which would bring us down the M6, but before that we had to navigate the A7 down to Carlisle. This road turned out to be an absolute treat, with tight twists and open stretches cutting through looming hills and following along rivers, giving off strong Black Forest vibes with the moist weather. The road opens out after passing through Langholm, becoming a fairly typical A road through the countryside, and we were stuck behind a vehicle seemingly keen on staying 10 mph below the limit. But our van just doesn't have the power to attempt an overtake on these roads, so we just sat back and enjoyed the scenery. Until there was one big straight where we could just about crawl past them. After that, it was the M6 all the way down to the M69 and then up to home. To be fair, the M6 is easily one of the most scenic motorways in the UK, making for a much more interesting drive home. I mean, it is a bit unfair to other motorways as none of the others go past the Lake District, but there's also plenty of overpasses and up and downy bits to keep the road ahead interesting enough. Just a quick note, we did stop at Moto Lancaster on the way back for a break, not realising that this is a tiny service station with very limited parking, to the point where the queue to get in was taking up most of the slip road and felt a bit dangerous to sit in it. I did feel a bit guilty parking our campervan in a spot designated for caravans, but that guilt soon washed away when I saw a Golf pull into another one of these spots. I mean, you see this everywhere and I just don't get it. Do people in little hatchbacks think they count as a coach? I know 5 seats is more than you usually need, but seriously, what's going on there? The rest of the journey was noteworthy only due to the several patches of crawling traffic that is typical of the British motorway network, except this time we had to watch bikers filter past with envy. But with July done to the best of our ability, we now look forward to August with the much more local destination of Castle Combe in the Cotswolds. This one is only about 2 hours away from us, so we might try and incorporate a visit to Cheddar Gorge while we're out that way. If you've made it this far in the video, you might as well give us a like and a subscribe to see the rest of our foolhardy year-long adventure, and we'll see you next time.